Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I am a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. In this episode, I thought that we could talk about heaven. I don't feel like I need to justify that. I mean, it's heaven, right? Am I right? One of my first conversations with Matt, when it was the Matt Fradd show instead of Pints with Aquinas, at least the YouTube version, we talked about heaven, and I enjoyed that conversation. And also since then, I've thought about it more. I hope I've thought about it well, but there's no guarantee of that. And in the community page on Matt's channel, folks have been asking questions about heaven as well. So I thought, take all those things together. It's important. People find it important. It's part of this show. So party on. Let's talk about heaven. Here we go. So to start the conversation, right, heaven, we profess belief in life everlasting. So that's just part of our Catholic faith. And you can see why, right? We have immaterial, which is to say immortal souls, and what we do with those souls, those embodied souls, matters. Insofar as we can choose for or against God, we can choose to merit or demerit, and so incur, salvation or perdition in light of the grace that God gives. And also, I think it's a fruitful topic for speculation because it's said explicitly in the sacred scriptures that eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, nor has it so much as dawned on the heart of man what God has ready for those who love him. So this for us is a kind of free space of theological speculation. Not in the sense that we can just say whatever we darn well please and get away with it, but I think it's a cool proving ground for what we believe about God and his Christ, creation, redemption, the sacramental dispensation, and other things. Like what will it look like, all right? So obviously, this is just a little thumbnail sketch. We're not going to cover everything. We're not even going to cover a portion, a small fragment, a percentage of everything. We're just going to cover some stuff. But I thought that one way to kind of march through it was to think about the last things, right? To think about what awaits us at the end of our life, and then how heaven kind of brings that experience to its completion. So at the end of our lives, we're going to die. We're going to be judged. Some of us, I suppose, will pass through purgatory. And then, please God, we attain to the life of heaven. I'm not going to address hell, but I've addressed hell in other videos. So it's not because hell isn't important as a theological subject of inquiry, nor should we get rid of hell from Christian preaching because it's just too tough. No, not saying that. I'm just saying I'm thinking about the soul who is progressing on his way towards heaven. And so we're going to think about death, judgment, purgatory, heaven, and what those things have to say to us about heaven. All right, so first, at the end of our days, we will die first. So what does it mean to die? Well, death is the separation of body and soul. We can speculate as to when that happens, what are the biological conditions for that happening, or we can just say, healthy philosophical distance, it's the separation of body and soul. And, practically important for our purposes here, it's the end for merit, okay? So it represents an end of our opportunity to merit glory or to demerit and potentially incur perdition, as it were. Now, at the end of one's life, please God, we've been living a life of penitence, a life of satisfaction, and attachment to sin has been rooted out of our lives and hearts, but that's not going to always be the case. There may be still, some work to be undertaken, but provided that we're in a state of grace, right, that we've chosen for God and against the life of sin, then we can have a certain confidence of going to heaven, but there might still be some dregs of sin or some attachments to sin, and then those particular things are going to need to be satisfied for in purgatory before one is prepared, as it were, to enter into the life of heaven to bear all that terrible weight of glory. Okay? So that's just death. That's not all that there is to death. That's something about death. All right, so after you die, you will be judged instantaneously and particularly. We're talking about the particular judgment here, not the general judgment. I'll have some more things to say about the general judgment in another video. Maybe it's already come out. Maybe it will come out. Maybe, who cares? All right, so you will be judged. Basically, what we mean to say is that at judgment, an account will be rendered on the basis of how you consented to and cooperated with the grace of God during your time on earth. All right? So God gives each soul, even the soul of the most hardened sinners, at least the grace sufficient to begin, as it were, to pray, right? To take the initial steps to turn to him. And so God desires that all be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. And if we attain to the life of heaven, it's by his grace. If we slouch on towards hell, it's by our free rejection of his offer of himself. So when we come before God, or when we come before the throne of judgment, an account will be rendered on the basis of whether or not we've done something with our lives to render them back to God. All right. So another way of thinking of it perhaps is, will you recognize the God by whom you are judged? Because you can live your life in such a way as to, be holy elsewhere. So when it comes time to behold him, you will not know him or love him because you will have lived apart from him. So that's kind of the basis of judgment. And then, you will, or we will, go to purgatory. So we sometimes talk, especially apropos of the Carmelite mystics, of purgation, the active and passive purgation of spirit and senses, or senses and spirit, to take them in the right order. So we have this sense that during the course of our lives, we're responsible for a modicum of purgation, but that God is ultimately in charge, as it were, of our purgation from sin, from the inclination to sin, from our attachment to sin, for any affection to sin. I'm thinking here of part 1 of the Introduction to the Devout Life. The way it ends kind of gives good indication as to what that purification might entail whilst here on earth. But if there remains as yet to be done, or if there remains work still to be undertaken, then God will do that for us in purgatory. And in purgatory, the idea is that you lend your heart to it, right? You lend your will to it. And so it ceases to be punishment and actually represents a sort of satisfaction, whereby you choose this as a way of atoning and as a way of growing into God so that you are worthy of the vision of heaven. So there are active and passive dimensions of this purgation. But ultimately here we see how suffering that we have endured on earth comes to its perfection in the life of purgatory, so as to prepare us for our conformity to Christ and our assimilation to the life of the Godhead that awaits us in heaven. All right, so then let's think about heaven in light of these facts. Well, I was thinking against the background of death, right, which represents this end to the state of merit, and which is a full stop, as it were, to our time on earth. The life of heaven is more stable or permanent by comparison. We can just simply say that the life of heaven is stable and permanent. So in light of the merits that one amassed, that's kind of a strange way to describe it, but in light of the way in which you lived while on earth, you will attain to a certain dignity or grandeur in heaven. Each will be glorious, each will be filled, but some will be more capacious for that glory, as it were, on account of how they chose to live, on account of how they responded to God's grace. So each will attain to his or her place among the ranks of the saints, among the ranks of the church triumphant. But to whichever rank or status one attains, one will have no fear of loss or of diminution of that glory. So it's a stable and permanent thing. It's something that's fixed. It's something that wholly captivates us. So we can't look away from God because there's nothing really to look away from God and find elsewhere, because you find everything in God. And there's no temptation, as it were, to do otherwise, because what? What's more glorious? What's more lovely? What's more beautiful than God? Nothing. Okay. So, death is, as it were, a preparation, or our passing through the instability and impermanence of this life, and then coming to the end at death is a preparation for the stability and permanence of heaven. All right, judgment. We said that judgment is that, moment in which an account is rendered, okay? And I think that what we enjoy in heaven is the harvest of that accounting. Okay, so let's say that during the course of your life, you sow seeds of righteousness, and then in judgment and ultimately in the life of heaven, those seeds which have, taken root, which have germinated, which have sprouted, which have grown, are then harvested. So heaven is the harvest. It's the place in which you come into the possession of, or you come into the fullness of, the truth of God and the truth of yourself. All right, the truth of who you are. You stand before the truth of your own life, and you abide in it, and you are reconciled to it. So there's no longer this kind of rebellion that things aren't fair, or things aren't as they should be, or things ought to be otherwise. It's just, this is what it is, and I embrace that. I enter into that. I rejoice in that. I glory in that, etc., etc. So we each have partaken in a particular way of Christ's merits, all right? And those merits attain to a certain, place, rank, status that we've described, as we have consented to and cooperated with them. And so in our judgment, in our judgment, but ultimately in the life of heaven, we receive, the fruits of that. All right. So all things are at last made manifest. All things are at last communicated to us. And there's a kind of vindication, a kind of setting straight, a kind of, cosmic justification or righteousness, which radiates through or resonates through the life of heaven. And I mean, ultimately, it's like it's a thing beyond judgment insofar as we profit from, or we benefit from, the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ. So if we attain to this place, it is by God's mercy. All right, we were thinking about purgatory, the way in which we're purified of all of these remaining dregs or attachments to sin, whether it be active or passive. Well, against the backdrop of purgatory, we can think about heaven as a place that is perfectly transparent to the working of grace. All right, so all that murky and muddy stuff in our life that kind of gets worked out in the life of purgatory makes it so that we're entirely transparent to, or translucent to, the working of grace in our life. And we become the perfect icon. All right, we become the perfect conduit. We become, the perfect testimony, as it were, of the glory of God. I think here of a line from one of Jared Manley Hopkins' poems where he says, "For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces." So each of us gives expression to the life of God, and specifically, to the sacred humanity of our Lord Jesus Christ in peculiar fashion. And as we are purified of the effects of vice, sin, temptation, etc., imperfection, whatever it be, light fault, then we become yet more holy the way in which we are meant to make manifest that glory of God in particular and unique fashion. All right, so Thomas Merton says the saint becomes himself, and in heaven you will be most holy yourself. For Christ, in the revelation of the Father, makes God known and man known to man himself. And then we will be made known to ourselves in the life of heaven, such that we come perfectly into that personality. All right, so in heaven you will be perfect. In heaven you will be complete. Something that I like to say, in heaven you are fire on all cylinders. And we're meant to, kind of grow towards that. And whatever is lacking in our earthly efforts is made up for in purgatory. But we see its full fruition in the life of heaven. And then thinking about heaven against the backdrop of heaven, which is a strange thing. Heaven will be the perfection, I guess. How would you describe this? Heaven is our perfect realization of the common good of the ecclesial life. All right, so heaven is a common possession of all the just, right, of all the elect, of all those who have come into possession of Christ's glory. But in heaven, we will possess Christ and be possessed by Christ perfectly, wholly and entirely. I was talking to a religious sister at one point, and she was describing how she wants an exclusive relationship with our Lord Jesus Christ in the way in which spouses have an exclusive relationship. And she couldn't imagine heaven insofar as Christ need there be shared. But I think that desire to possess Christ wholly and entirely, that will be met, not in the sense that you're going to want to hold other people off at arm's length, but you will have Christ wholly and entirely insofar as you will be his wholly and entirely, which is the only way to have him. All right, so there'll be this kind of experience, as it were, of exclusivity, but without the limitations of it. And then this experience that we presently have of distance will be banished, right? So we won't be haunted or we won't be vexed by the experience of being, it'll just be whole and entire. And in the life of the church, right, we'll begin to rejoice in that in a way that, attains to its full height or full grandeur, right? So we'll no longer say mine and thine in the same kind of greedy, selfish, avaricious way as before. We'll genuinely be able to say ours, right? And we'll be able to rejoice in the common possession of God and all things in light of God without any fear, again, of loss or diminution, without any fear of having been, divided in our person. Because we'll have attained to God, who is the most common of good, which is to say, the greatest of goods, the most communicable of goods, which is in no wise diminished in being communicated broadly, which is a glorious vision to behold. So I thought that this is one way in which we could approach the theme of heaven, just to talk a little bit about death, judgment, purgatory, and then the possession of heaven itself, and just kind of sort out our various experiences, hopes, dreams, aspirations, desires, thoughts, musings, etc., and then just situate them within the tradition of the church's life, and then give some flesh, as it were, to that sometimes ethereal vision. So is that, an entirely apt or perfect rendering of heaven? No, but we knew it wasn't going to be, right? But it should, please God, stir up our desire for that life so that we might strive towards the attainment thereof with ever greater, consent to and cooperation with the grace that God gives. So, boom, that's what I hope to share. This is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, and get email updates when other things come out. And then if you haven't yet, check out Godsplaining, which is a podcast to which I contribute with 4 other Dominican friars. And we have conversations on all kinds of themes, among which heaven is numbered. And you can find that on YouTube or on any podcast app. And then lastly, I wrote a book, and it's called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. It's been out now for a couple months. But if you haven't yet, I'd love it if you're able to read it, maybe give me some feedback. But please God, ultimately, the hope is that we'll help you in your own journey to heaven. So, boom. My prayers are for you. Please pray for me. And I'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Pints with Aquinas.